The sun rose gently over the sleepy town of Willow's End, casting long golden beams across dew-covered lawns and creaky front porches. Somewhere between the hush of waking birdsong and the soft rattle of wind chimes, a story was about to tug, loose from the past quietly, patiently, like an old thread being pulled from a forgotten coat. If you blinked, you might have missed the house entirely. It sits behind a veil of lilac and hedge, two cracked stone lions guarding its entrance, and a winding path half covered in moss and memory. There, in this corner of the world untouched by hurry or noise, lived a creature so slow he could hardly catch a breeze. His name was Harold, and he was a tortoise. Not just a pet, not a novelty passed around at backyard birthday parties. Harold had a presence, the way old trees have presence, the kind of slowness that somehow made you quieter just by being near it. People say time moves differently around tortoises. Maybe that's why things buried deep have a way of surfacing when they're around. Willow's End was the kind of town where neighbors still waved from their mailboxes, where time seemed to dawdle, distracted just enough to let stories settle, in thick swirls along fence posts and porch swings. It's also the kind of place where, every so often, something quiet and improbable happens. Something just odd enough that it refuses to be ignored, because once, not too long ago, a 96-year-old tortoise wandered out of his gate and walked straight into the heart of a long-lost family secret. But we'll get there, but first, picture a garden, nothing fancy, just potted geraniums leaning toward the sun, a peeling bench beneath a sagging peach tree, and an old wheelbarrow overtaken by morning glories. This garden belonged to Miriam Aldrich, a widow who wore her silence like a shawl draped gently across her shoulders. She'd lived in that two-story farmhouse for as long as anyone could remember. Her hands bore the map of her years, knotted, precise, always moving. But in recent times, her only company had been Harold, passing one another slowly, day after day. Like two ancient ships brushing holes in a sea of grass, Miriam spoke less these days, not because she had nothing to say, because the person she would have said it to hadn't knocked on her door in a decade. But sometimes, just before dusk, you might have seen her place a letter on the garden table, read it aloud, pause, and then quietly, wordlessly, tuck it back into a drawer where dozens of others slept beside brittle photographs and frayed ribbon. Grief can be loud, but it can also be desperately quiet, and Harold, he never asked questions. He simply lumbered, from leaf pile to shade patch, bearing the slow weight of presence. A creature who'd witnessed nearly a century, and never once hurried through any of it. They say some hearts beat not in haste, but in rhythm with the earth. It was one such morning bright with promise, though no one suspected it, that the wind carried a scent of change through the trees. Light filtered differently that day, dancing across the lawn in unfamiliar patterns. And Harold, who hadn't wandered farther than the garden pear tree in 5 years, stood curiously at the broken corner of the old wooden fence. It had cracked silently in the night, a casualty of time and rot. No one saw it fall, but for Harold, the world that had always stopped at the edge of his garden had gently opened its hand. This is not a tale of miraculous speed or heroic deeds. It's not about thunder or rescue or epiphany. It's about what happens when things move slowly enough for old wounds to air out, for people to listen instead of speak, and for a creature who never rushed anything to arrive when he was needed. How could something so slow change everything? You'd be surprised. In the long, dappled shadows beneath the garden's elder trees, Harold began his morning exactly the same way he had for decades. Slowly and in absolute silence, the sun warmed his ancient shell as he nosed toward the same patch of clover just beside the tipped-over watering can. His footsteps, deliberate and dusted with grass, seemed carved from a different rhythm, time long disjointed from clocks and schedules. Unwinding instead in a soft spiral of days, Harold, an African spurred tortoise centrously sulcata, if one were feeling precise, had lived longer than most of the trees that shaded him. He was 96, or maybe 97. Even Miriam wasn't entirely sure anymore. Not that Harold kept count. Every cracked scute on his shell held the ghost of seasons past. Dry summers buzzing with cicadas, rains that teased peony blossoms into bloom, winters where he waited inside beside the radiator while Miriam knit scarves she never wore. To know Harold was to know patience. He had a way of being still so completely, so wholly unbothered by the whistles and clatter of life, that even squirrels paused to observe his motionlessness in reverence. Not that Harold noticed. He was too busy being. Miriam often joked, though lightly, for jokes had become rare in the years trailing her husband's death. Harold had the expressions of a curmudgeon too dignified to care about anything new. And it was true his downturned beak gave him the look of a stern philosopher, frustrated perhaps by the foolishness of passing fads or the mystery of squirrels. But he had never snapped, never hissed. For all his age and craggy edges, Harold was tender in his pace, soft-eyed, deeply present. She used to tell the story often, how her late husband Ernest had found Harold, limp and half-buried at the side of Route 9, tiny thing then, no bigger than to open palms. One wheel of a long-forgotten truck had clipped him back in '63, and Ernest hadn't hesitated. He pulled over at once, stood up in church the next Sunday, and declared, "God placed this creature in my path for a reason." The congregation chuckled kindly, as they always did when Ernest spoke without warning. And no one questioned it when Harold was later seen sunning himself between the lilies and the freshly painted garden gnome. They became a trio, quiet, well-matched, odd to any looking from the outside in. Ernest carved Harold his own house out of reclaimed wood, miniature barn with a shingled roof and little painted horses on its door. That Harold never used it consistently seemed to bother Ernest less than it delighted him. Miriam had often caught him humming to Harold on autumn evenings, their silhouettes twin lumps beside the dahlias. Years slid past. The house creaked and settled, its bones a little more each season. Miriam's hair paled like the morning mist, and the garden outpaced her in wild, poetic chaos. But Harold remained a constant shape between vines and memory. Neighborhood children visited often in earlier days. They'd crowd around Harold like Beatles' pilgrims, offering him strawberries or slow blinks meant to mimic kindness. Little fingers touched his shell reverently, curiosity softened by his gentleness. He never minded. Once a toddler placed her entire hand on his shell and declared with wide sincerity, "He feels like the ground, but older." Even after they grew and moved away, traces of their wonder clung to the fence corners, to the little white stones they had placed around his favorite nap spot. Some days Miriam found new ones, painted smooth and colorful, left beside a patch of lettuce by someone too shy to knock. To everyone in Willow's End, Harold was not a pet. He was a certainty, like the postman who always wore the same plaid vest, or the grocery cart that veered left on its own. He was steady where life was not. And he watched, year after year. Harold observed life's small symphonies from beneath hydrangea leaves. He saw Miriam stoop with slower grace. He saw her late husband's laughter fade from the air like old perfume. He heard the quiet shift when the birds no longer landed as close, unsure perhaps of the new emptiness around her. When Clara stopped visiting, Harold noticed he didn't rush to the fence in mourning, didn't fuss, but he lingered more near the gate for a while, as though waiting for sounds he half remembered. He had always liked Clara. She'd been the boldest, child racing barefoot to the garden with a jam jar in hand, insisting it made the perfect tortoise. Bowl if you just leaned it right. She was the one who brushed Harold's shell with a toothbrush every Friday afternoon of her 12th summer, whispering secrets into the wind as he blinked at the sun. There were no toothbrush visits now, no voices, just Miriam's slow shuffles, her murmurs to herself, the occasional radio static drifting in from the kitchen, and still Harold. Miriam sometimes wondered aloud if Harold realized how much he meant to her. She would say things like, "You're the only punctual gentleman left in my life," or, "Look at you, carriage and all, hauling history through my garden." He never replied, of course, but he'd stop moving briefly, tilt his head upward and fix her with that slow, unblinking stare that seemed to hold the weight of all she wouldn't say. There were moments when Miriam wished she had his calm, the way he wore silence like armor not as loneliness, but as shelter. The truth was, letters had become her way of speaking when no one answered. Dozens lived in a drawer now, all addressed to Clara, some angry, some soft, some with ink blurred by tears she didn't admit to, but none had stamps. None had left the house. Harold's lumbering steps passed them often. Their stillness echoed his own dot, and so the days trundled on. Sunlight pooled in the same cracks of the kitchen tile, birds returned to the same feeders, and Harold inched his silent paths, circle after circle. Miriam watched and whispered whatever guilt or pride came between her and Clara. Whichever one had locked the door all those years ago, Harold sat between them now, breathing relic, living bridge. He bore it all without hurry or complaint. That fall, Miriam planted marigolds along the fence, though her hands trembled more than she'd like. Harold sat near the pots as though supervising. His presence, as always, demanded nothing but offered everything. And when leaves began to curl, brown and distant geese took to the sky, Harold adjusted his path toward the old woodpiler, sure. Sin the season was changing, even if no one spoke it aloud. Somewhere beyond the lilacs and memory, a story had begun shuffling toward them quietly. Of course, because Harold always knew when it was time to move. Clara Aldridge had not spoken her mother's name aloud in over 7 years. It had started small, as these things often do, a tense conversation over a coffee table inheritance, an accusation flicked under breath, a silence that hardened by the week when her husband Mark passed away unexpectedly just a few months later. Grief tangled itself with estrangement so tightly that Clara barely noticed how months folded into years. What had once been monthly phone calls turned to unanswered texts, and then nothing. Truthfully, she could no longer remember who had spoken last or what had been said. But the sympathetic familiar had filled the space between her and Miriam like water in a deep well. Her children, Owen and Emma, never questioned the gap. Owen was 15 now, curious and kind, with his father's quiet eyes and a perpetual set of earbuds nestled beneath his hoodie's edge. Emma, 12, was a different sort, altogether sharp in instinct, tender in ways only a child wholly unscathed by adult bitterness could be. Neither child knew much beyond what few have. Clara allowed through. "My mum lives far away," she would say. "We're not close." Once Emma asked why. Clara changed the subject. She always changed the subject. They'd never met their grandmother, never stepped foot in that sagging old farmhouse with the creaky porch swing and the garden bursting with more weeds than vegetables. They certainly didn't know about Harold. Clara hadn't spoken of him since she left. It wasn't that she didn't remember, quite the opposite. The tortoise had been an anchor in her strange, tangled childhood. Some days, when Mark was still alive and the children were small and asleep, she'd catch herself drawing quiet spirals in the steam on the bathroom mirror, just like she used to trace Harold's shell. And then she'd wipe it away quickly, the way someone closes a journal even they aren't meant to read. Now, the floor of their one-story home in Oakbend was littered with the ordinary chaos of suburbia: soccer socks, phone chargers, a casserole pan beneath a pile of unopened mail. A clock ticked somewhere loud enough to feel unkind. Outside, the world breathed past in cars and grocery runs. Inside, Clara kept her grief like pressed lavender between pages, a quiet shadow only visible when the light hit just right. Mark's absence still filled the room more than any presence. It lived in the way Clara tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, in the moments she stared just a beat too long at his empty chair during dinner. Every bedtime story she read to Emma with that slight catch in her voice, every sip of coffee, untouched cows of a world interrupted. Emma didn't understand the weight, but she felt it like static in the air. She didn't say much, out of respect or fear of poking a bruise too deep. Owen asked once, after a school project on family trees, if they had any pictures of her parents. Clara had merely said, "They're packed away." There were no wedding photos on the mantel, no handwritten notes, no mementos from the farmhouse, only Mark's smile immortalized in a photo on the fridge, and the occasional card from her sister-in-law in Vermont. Some Sundays, Clara drove past the old Lutheran church where Mark used to sing in the choir. She never parked, just looped slowly, headlights washing over the same patch of brick, whispering apologies into the steering wheel like prayers. Clara hadn't sent a letter to Miriam. At first it was stubbornness, that adolescent pride that clung to her even into her 30s. But by now, the silence had become its own kind of fortress. To breach, it felt less like picking up the phone, and more like crossing a sea she'd forgotten how to swim. All the while, Miriam had written letters, dozens of them, tucked into cloth-bound journals, beneath Afghans, between old casserole recipes. Some bristled with frustration. "I named the house in the will after you, and you still won't speak to me." Others were little more than wishful weather reports and garden updates. But none had made the journey to Oakbend. Harold, of course, knew none of this, at least not in the way people measure knowing, but he bore witness, slowly, without comment, the way only a long-lived creature can witness, through routine, through presence, through subtle shifts in atmosphere. It was Harold, indeed, who sat beneath Miriam's chair one evening when she truly tried, to write another letter to Clara, and instead spent 20 minutes whispering the first 3 sentences into her tea. And it was Harold who had heard every whispered apology, every unfinished sentence spoken to no one back in Oakbend. Clara watched Emma stir oatmeal and thought briefly of the orchard tree where she once hid a tin of animal crackers for Harold, calling it his treasure chest. She hadn't told her daughter any of that. Not the summers she read Nancy Drew out loud to a tortoise who blinked solemnly in return. Not the day she confided her first heartbreak to his moss-lick shell beneath a bowing willow. Not even the moment. Harold cocked his head just slightly. When she whispered she wanted to run away, she hadn't said those things because to do so would unlock an avalanche. And Clara had grown so tired of uphill climbs. Miriam still held onto a photograph of her daughter at 16, barefoot in the grass, with Harold just behind her, munching a tomato like it was a jewel. The photo lived on the mantel now, between dust and a small ceramic angel whose hand had chipped off years ago. The whole family, though broken, existed in these thin echoes, like music muffled through a locked door. And Harold, he continued his slow revolutions in the garden every morning, a watchful sentinel. If he missed Clara, he revealed it only in the way his path lingered each day near the fence gate. By the hedge Clara once trimmed with too much enthusiasm. Near the long cold chimney they once shared roasted corn beside. On the morning Harold disappeared, the world tilted not catastrophically, not with violence, but enough that even the silence could no longer stretch far enough to hold what needed release. And though none of them knew it yet, that slow creature's absence would become the first true invitation for something else to return. Something long buried, something left unsaid for far too long. The storm had come suddenly that night, not with thunder or spectacle, just a steady, deliberate rain that soaked the earth and softened the aging edges of the world. The town of Willow's End slept beneath a quilt of grey clouds. In Miriam's home, windows trembled gently in their frames, wind curling like breath through the tiny gaps in old wood. Outside, the garden drank deeply. The marigolds dipped their heads. Ivy clung tighter to the crumbling trellis. And near the southern edge, where the fence met the blackberry thicket, a beam gave way with a hollow grown dot. No one heard it fall. The next morning, the sun blinked back through parting clouds. A soft golden hush hung over everything, as if the world was waiting for someone to notice something had changed. Miriam noticed first the quiet. She had risen early, as always, wrapping a knitted shawl around her shoulders before her slippers touched the creaking floorboards. In the kitchen, the kettle burbled. Outside, chimes danced with the leftover breeze. She opened the back door, expecting to see Harold beside the porch steps, exactly where he'd been every morning since early spring. But there was only Clover, no shifting mound, no steady gait, just absence. She chuckled at first. "You're playing?" "Coy, Harold," she murmured, stepping into the garden. But 20 minutes passed. Every shadow searched. No sign. It wasn't until she reached the broken slats in the fence, half hidden by the unruly hedge, that the laughter died in her throat. Single track of shallow, deliberate footprints led away through the drizzle-stained moss. Miriam didn't cry right away. She touched the splintered wood, let her fingers trail the cracked edge, then stood motionless for several minutes, as though silence might conjure an answer. Only the wind responded. By noon, the entire neighborhood knew. Flyers were printed hastily up. A dozen inkjet sheets with a grainy photo from 3 summers ago, Harold nosing at a pumpkin, half out of frame. Missing tortoise months from 100 DEA flow. Sweet, it read. With a phone number bolded in blue dot. The coffee shop hung one. So did the post office, even though the clerk grumbled about policy. A group of neighborhood children took up the cause with chalk drawings on the sidewalks, crude outlines of shells, alongside pleas scribbled in pastel. help Harold come home. The local feed lit up, a flurry of shared memories and blurry backyard sightings. And through it all, Miriam sat by the garden table, each hour folding her more tightly inward. Not once did she blame the rot, not the wind, not even the rain. She blamed herself. That evening, she cradled a tin of strawberries in her lap, the ones she would usually dice into thin slices just for Harold's breakfast. And for the first time in many years, she wept not the steady tears she'd occasionally let fall when a song reminded her of Ernest, or when a letter returned to her drawer unsent. This was different. This grief was sharp, immediate, like a cut that bled from an older wound. She whispered his name once into the twilight, then again. The town kept searching. Reports trickled in. One older couple swore they saw something slow and shell-shaped near the old community garden. A jogger caught a glimpse near the hardware store parking lot but claimed it may have been a weirdly shaped rock. Someone else found tracks not unmistakable, but possible cutting through the sand by the duck pond near Sycamore Park. Yet Harold remained missing. Fate, however, doesn't just tug on one thread. Across the state, in the town of Brook Hill, Clara scrolled idly through her feed, half watching the television flicker beside her. Politics, rainfall, a cooking segment. She was about to put the phone down when an image gave her pause. It wasn't just the poorly lit summer photo, or the odd, slightly misspelled flyer headline. It was the name Harold. She blinked once, twice. Her heart stuttered. The caption read, "Lost senior tortoise in Willow's End town icon. Please share." She stared, hand frozen above her coffee mug. Willow's End. The curve of that garden in the background. That pealing wind chime on the porch beam. How many tortoises named Harold are there? She whispered to no one. Emma breezed past the room, chasing the cat with a ball of string, oblivious to her mother's stillness. Owen's door clicked shut in the hallway. Somewhere, a car honked into silence. But for Clara, time had slowed to a crawl. She tapped the photo again, zoomed into the corner where the shadow of the house loomed behind a summer spruce. That house, her house, or it had been, back when the world still made sense. A decade of silence. All it took for something to break through was a Facebook post about a 96-year-old tortoise. She expected confusion, maybe guilt. But what hit her instead was a winded kind of ache, a knowing. As if something long buried had finally emerged for air. Emma stared at the photo on her mother's phone for a long time after Clara left it on the counter. The tortoise's name, Harold, kept echoing in her mind like a skipped stone. She couldn't explain it, but something in the picture pulled at her. Maybe it was the look beneath the tortoise's shell edge, the kind of calm she'd only ever seen in the pages of stories. Or maybe it was the house behind him, all overgrown and dreamy. Like the fairy tale gardens Emma liked to sketch in her notebooks when she was supposed to be doing math. Harold, it wasn't exactly the kind of name that slipped past. You, Iselin, not. For a tortoise anyway. By dinner she had seen the post too many times to ignore. It was spreading rapidly now, thanks to a small animal rescue page that reposted with a caption calling Harold an elder statesman of the reptile world. Emma laughed under her breath at that, then tilted her head up. "Mum," she asked, picking at the corner of her toast. "That tortoise, do you know him?" Clara froze, slicing carrots mid-air. She didn't look at her daughter right away. "Why would you say that?" Emma shrugged, but Owen looked up from his phone. "Because you gasped earlier when you saw it. You totally recognized him." Clara turned slowly, meeting Owen's eyes, then Emma's. She opened her mouth, closed it again. The clock in the kitchen ticked louder than usual. He's from my childhood, she said finally, quietly. We had him when I was a kid, at my mother's home, so he's Grandma's. Emma blinked. I didn't know you had a tortoise, Clara corrected without thinking. Her voice caught on the word. He's ancient. I guess he still lives with her. Owen leaned his arms on the table. Wait, you never told us about her. His voice wasn't accusing, just curious. Grandma, like your mum? No, Clara said, leaning back against the counter. I didn't. There it was, thick in the air. Not anger, not exactly, but something stretched out between Emma's tilted head and Owen's questioning eyes that made Clara feel like she was standing far away from all the things she could no longer ignore. It's complicated, she whispered. Emma put down her fork. Is she nice? Clara hesitated. She's single quotes, art ... strong, garden obsessed, stubborn, and she loved that tortoise with everything she had. There was silence again. You think she's okay? Owen asked. I mean, if he's gonna Harold die, bet she's really worried. Clara flinched. She couldn't help but imagine her mother in the garden alone, searching, hurting in that quiet, terrible way she used to when Dad had died, her fists clenched by her sides. She's probably devastated, she admitted. He's been her only companion for years now. Emma was already on her feet. We have to help. No, Clara said reflexively. But why not? Emma said. It's just a visit. Maybe we could drive there tomorrow, help look. Clara looked down at the counter, then quietly placed the knife into the sink. Owen stood too, more measured. Mom, he said slowly, if she's alone, and a 96-year-old tortoise is wandering out there all by himself. There are animal control people and volunteers, Clara said quickly. Hollow, the whole neighborhood's probably helping already. Emma's voice was small. You really don't want to go, do you? Clara wiped her palms on a dish towel. It's not that simple. But he's part of our family, Owen said, holding up the screen. You said so. Clara's eyes brimmed, unspoken history pooling behind them. They weren't just talking about the tortoise anymore. Emma came closer, stood beside her mother, not touching her, but near enough to say, I'm still here. Was he really yours too? Emma asked softly. Clara nodded, one hand clutching her opposite wrist. For a while, she whispered. He was my secret keeper, my listener. I used to tell him everything, and he always seemed to know more than the rest of us. Emma glanced at Owen. He gave a small nod. Then we should find him, she said. Clara looked at her children. How tall Owen had grown, how Emma's face still glowed with unspoiled belief, and despite her own walls and wounds, something inside crumbled just slightly. All right, she said, barely audible. We'll go. Just a short visit, just to help. By the next morning, Clara was double-knotting Emma's sneakers, trying to pretend her heart wasn't pounding. Owen loaded snacks into the back seat, pretzels, water bottles, a slightly squashed cheese sandwich. The GPS said 5 hours, give or take. Back roads mostly, through towns whose names Clara hadn't spoken out loud in a decade. The air in the car was muted. Owen played playlists quietly through a single earbud and stared out the window. Emma sketched tortoises and suspiciously overgrown gardens in her notebook, humming soft instrumentals. Clara gripped the wheel and kept her eyes on the road, though they wandered more often than not to the rearview mirror, where memory pressed up against the glass. They passed the Lutheran church around 2 in the afternoon. Clara's breath caught. The whole town was smaller than she remembered. Brighter in some places, quieter in others. Flyers were still up-taped sloppily to telephone poles and rusty trash bins. Cartoonish drawings of Harold, his wrinkled grey head peeking from the corner of each page. Emma practically bounced. "It's real. We're close." Clara parked 2 blocks away and turned off the engine. The house looked exactly the same, though. The hedge was thicker, and the peach tree leaned more heavily toward the road. The cracked stone lions at the path's entrance were still there. Faces chipped with time, but posture proud. Her stomach twisted. "We can go knock," Owen offered gently. But Clara shook her head. Emma stepped forward. The garden gate creaked. Open, no one answered. They waited. No footsteps, no voice, just the sound of far-off wind and a single bird trilling overhead. It was Emma Small, almost whisper-light, who drifted toward the edge of the property. Near the old churchyard, just beyond the scatter of daffodils reaching through the fence. "Mum," she called. Clara turned. Emma was crouched low beside a weathered bench itself, bent with rust and root sand behind it. In the gathering dusk, of ivy and dappled sunlight, something blinked slowly, a domed shell, speckled with mud and leaves, barely moving but unmistakably there. Owen hustled closer. "It's him," he breathed. Harold. Clara's hands flew to her mouth. Her knees gave slightly dot. Emma looked up with a grin. He was just waiting. Clara knelt beside him, reaching out gently. Her fingers trembled before finally making contact with the familiar curve of Harold's shell. He didn't flinch. Of course not. He simply blinked once and stayed. Owen dropped to his knees beside the bench, his breath visible in the cool evening air. He reached out, tentative fingers brushing the mud-flecked dome with the care of someone touching treasure rather than shell. "He's warm," Owen said, softly glancing back toward Clara and Emma. "He's okay." Emma let out a sharp exhale of relief, her laughter catching halfway into a sob. Clara stood motionless a few feet away, eyes locked on the creature who had once carried so many of her childhood secrets. She stepped forward slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the garden path itself was stitched with memory. The sun drifted behind a bank of lilac clouds, and the silence in that space between them all felt sacred. When she finally stood above him, Clara placed her hand on the shell beside Owen's. "Hey, old friend," she whispered. Harold blinked once, then another. A slow, deliberate movement that felt somehow like recognition. Together, they lifted Harold. Owen in front, Clara behind, Emma easing her small hands underneath to help navigate the uneven walk back to the house. He wasn't light, but he was steady, and in the grip of that moment, full of familiarity and gravity. Weight was no burden at all. Miriam had been napping in her chair by the window, a hand still curled around an envelope, never mailed. The sound of footsteps startled her awake. She reached for her glasses, but paused when she heard something young, honest, unfiltered laughter. She moved to the open door slowly, her slippers scuffing softly against the floor. Clara was the first thing she saw. Time didn't move in those seconds. It folded, hair grayer, face thinner, but still those cheekbones that Ernest once said could cut through sorrow. She stood in the garden with her hands on Harold's shell, her daughter beside her, her son at her shoulder. Miriam didn't speak, neither did Clara. They just looked. It had been years, a decade, of unanswered letters and silences saturated with loss. And still, in this suspended moment. It didn't matter how badly the words had tangled or how many fences had splintered between them. You always had his eyes. Miriam murmured at last, barely loud enough for the wind to carry. Clara blinked, hard. Her mouth opened, a flicker of something soft in her throat, but no words came at first. She nodded instead, a slow gesture, small and unguarded. Emma stepped forward, still holding Harold from one side. "Is this his spot?" she asked, looking at the patch of marigolds still gold with late summer bloom. Miriam nodded. "Every afternoon, right there by the stones," she said. Her voice cracked under the memory. They set Harold down gently. The tortoise ambled a few feet, deliberate as ever, and stopped beside the low bench Miriam kept forgetting to repaint. He sank into the grass almost immediately, pulling in his limbs, his head still visible, half-tucked with the ease of a returned voyager. Miriam sat, slowly on the porch steps, her hands clasped together like they were holding onto something unseen. Clara walked forward, hesitated again, then took a seat beside her. For a long time, no one spoke. The children settled near the garden edge, where Owen pulled a twig from the ground and began drawing idle circles in the dirt. Emma stretched her legs, watching a butterfly wobble through the air above Harold's shell. "I didn't know he'd still be alive," Clara said quietly, eyes forward. "Neither did I," Miriam replied. "But some hearts outlive even what they're waiting for." Clara glanced down at her lap. "I saw the post. I didn't plan to come, not really. But I'm glad you did," Miriam interrupted gently. "Even if you didn't plan it." They sat in that space between noise and truth, letting silence soften what time had hardened. Nearby, Emma reached toward Harold with a fresh leaf of romaine. He blinked up at her and nudged it once before beginning his slow, grateful bite. "That one's Emma," Clara said softly. "She likes drawing stories and finding strays." Miriam nodded. "I can see that. And Owen," she added, glancing toward the still figure beside the tree. "He carries more than he says, like his father." Miriam breathed carefully, hands folding tighter. "He looks like you used to. The eyebrows especially." Clara smiled faintly. "He's calmer than I ever was." "Maybe Harold passed on a bit of that," Miriam said. They let that laughter, small and cautious, bridge the gap again, the sound curling into the air, between them like smoke from warm-kindled coals, as twilight slipped over the sky with gentle insistence. Clara looked around the garden, noting all the ways it had changed, how much of it remained exactly as she remembered. The peeling fence, the leaning bench, the hedgerow that once hid her teenage poetry, and Harold right in the middle, like some ancient lighthouse blinking through the fog of their shared story. That night, hours later, Emma pressed a fountain pen to the soft page of her journal. Her handwriting was crooked from the car ride and lantern light, but her words were steady. "We found him," she wrote. "And maybe something else too. Not everything's fixed yet, but something has started again. It feels slow, like the way Harold walks, but sure, somehow." She dotted her last sentence with care. "We found more than a tortoise today." Upstairs, Clara curled beneath a borrowed quilt in her childhood room while Miriam sipped tea from the old chipped mug she'd once sworn never to use again. Outside, under the peach tree, Harold dreamed of strawberries and summer warmth. Unmoved but not unmoving, and beneath the heavy sky, 3 generations exhaled together again, almost whole. A week passed. The mornings returned, first those quiet amber hours, when fog hovered low and dew settled on the thorny skin of ripening tomatoes. The garden woke to the sound of Emma's laughter dancing through the hedgerows, Owen's cautious footsteps over gravel, and Clara's voice tentative but present, calling out to her children from the old porch steps, just as Miriam once had on warm school day mornings. There was no ceremony about their staying. After Harold was found, Clara simply asked if they might stay another night, and then another. Miriam had nodded wordlessly, as though she had always expected this unspoken extension, as if her bones had kept a bed warm all these years. The fence was the first thing Clara fixed. On the second morning, she pulled on a pair of earnest old gardening gloves, their fingertips soft and rounded with time, and set to work without speaking. She removed the rotted slats slowly, one by one, piling them beside the composting hydrangeas. Owen joined her mid-morning with a hammer in hand and an almost smile ghosting his lips. They worked in rhythm, nails passed back and forth, boards aligned and measured. No music, just birdsong and the occasional creak of a jolted wood sighing back into place. At one point, Clara brushed sawdust from Owen's shoulder, and he didn't pull away. Inside, Miriam and Emma made pancakes. The batter was lumpy, the first few to crisp, but laughter seasoned the rest. Afterward, they stood together at the sink, watching bees court lavender through the window, bubbles sliding down plates like slow-moving stars. Your mama used to burn hers too, Miriam said, handing Emma a striped towel. Emma grinned. Maybe it skips a generation. Later that day, they cleared the weedy fringe near the peach tree, where Harold now spent his afternoons half submerged in grass, eyeing the world like a philosopher with no need to speak. Clara found an old metal watering can still filled with dust and cobwebs, and together they rinsed it clean in the rain barrel, before replenishing the marigolds that had begun to wilt in their absence. Emma named them, one for each memory she imagined: Ernest, the swing, the cat no one remembered, the blue rhododendrons, Hope. On Thursday, an article popped up in the Willow's End Chronicle under the local events column: The Lost Tortoise Who Found a Family. It was brief and gently written, no drama, no regret, just a simple recounting of Harold's disappearance and trail home, plus a photo of Miriam, Owen, Clara, and Emma standing behind him like sentries. Harold, true to form, paid the camera no attention. Clara laughed when she saw the photo, her arm unconsciously slipping round Emma's shoulders, even as they stood in the grocery line, reading it off someone else's copy. Famous, Emma whispered. With delight, Miriam began letting the neighborhood children back into the garden the next weekend. Word had spread. Little hands knocked gently at the gate, and with each creak of rusted hinge, a new child appeared shy, giggling. Amazed, Emma became their guide, showing them where Harold liked to nap only behind the bench in the morning. What snack he liked best: strawberries, definitely, and which parts of the garden to tread carefully. One boy offered a painted rock shaped like a turtle shell. Emma placed it beside Harold's favorite stone and pronounced it his honorary twin. That Sunday morning, Clara awoke to the smell of bean stew wafting from the kitchen. She padded barefoot downstairs, swept up in the familiar crackle of vinyl playing faintly from a dusty record player, Carole King. Scratched but warm, Man saw her mother turning slowly at the stovetop, ladle in hand, humming with an ease only. Recently returned. "Good morning," Clara said. Miriam turned, her face soft with contentment. "You always did sleep late on Sundays." Clara leaned against the frame and smiled. guess not all things change. That afternoon, Owen patched the back gate, rebuilding it sturdier than before, while Harold watched from a patch of dappled sunlight as if granting his silent approval. The rhythms of the house grew fuller, not louder, just more layered. The porch swing moved again, its rust forgiven by careful oiling. The radio lived in the kitchen again, humming old tunes into the cracks of the floorboards. Emma began reading to Harold at dusk, retelling parts of her favorite fantasy novels with wild voices and generous pauses, just as Clara had once done. Sometimes Miriam and Clara sat beside one another on that bench beneath the peach tree with tea in hand and silence between them, not tense, but companionable now, like a well-worn shawl covering both sets of shoulders. No grand apologies had been exchanged, no tidy explanations offered, but each small gesture carried the weight of something being carefully mended. A flower repotted, a meal shared, hands brushing during planting, laughter left unguarded, and Harold remained in the center of it all, quiet and constant, bearing witness to the rhythms of return. One afternoon, while clearing ivy from the garden's far corner, Emma uncovered a tiny, rusted tin box. Inside it, she found old beads, a photograph sun-faded nearly beyond recovery, and a note in childish handwriting that read, "For Harold, secrets, snacks, and dreams. Tilda, C." She ran inside, waving it overhead. Clara froze at the sight of it, recognition blooming slow as a rose. "I forgot I even made that," she said, brushing dust from the lid. "I used to think if I kept my worries in there, they couldn't follow me inside at night." Emma closed the box, smiling. "Maybe we could fill it again." Clara looked out the window at Harold blinking beside the marigold pots and nodded. "Maybe we already are." 1 year later, the garden was blooming again. Peach blossoms opened in soft blush across crooked branches, bending gracefully toward the ground like old women leaning in to whisper secrets. The marigolds were taller now, thick with color, their petals like thumbprints of sunlight pressed into the soil. Harold moved slower these days. His steps were less purposeful, more meandering. Sometimes he paused for long stretches between breaths, as if listening to something just below the hum of the world. The house remained mostly the same, still creaky, still fragrant with time. In the kitchen, Clara had taken to using Miriam's old recipe book, greasy with memories, flour dusted along the margins. Bean stew simmered again on Sundays. Vinyl still crackled softly in the background, even during chores. And sometimes, when Owen stayed up too late, studying at the kitchen table, he would swear the shadows in the corner still smelled faintly of talcum powder and leaf rot and something too tender to name. After Miriam passed early one spring morning, her favorite mug beside her and a newspaper folded against her chest, the silence felt different. Not hollow, but full somehow. Clara had found the letter she'd tried to write 100 times near her bedside. It wasn't signed, it didn't need to be. They buried her beneath the peach tree, in the corner of the garden where the roots cooled the earth even in midsummer. Her headstone was simple, her name a carved flower. Above it, Owen had etched a small tortoise shell, imperfect but precise. At the memorial, neighbors came with flowers, with soft hands and words borrowed from hymns and old recipes. The neighborhood children brought Harold-painted stones, each one placed gently round the tree like sacred offerings. No one spoke too loudly. No one rushed to leave. Clara read a short passage from a letter she'd found in Miriam's drawer, not addressed to anyone, simply dated in faded pen. There's peace in the garden, but only when shared. Too many years I sat alone in it, forgetting that simple truth. I hope one day you walk these rows again, not just for Harold, but for yourself. The days that followed unfolded slowly, not heavy, not empty, just quieter. Clara and the children stayed. It was never decided that they would, they just didn't leave. At first, there were drawers to sift through, clutter to sort. But time turned those tasks into patterns, and patterns into routines. Clara found herself rising early again, slipping into Miriam's old slippers, her footsteps following paths she'd once resisted and now knew by heart. Owen installed a small bench near the edge of the garden where birds gathered between seedcorings. Emma painted it with vines and tortoise shells, pops of turquoise and soft pink blooming along the arms. They called it Waiter's Rest, a name Harold always seemed to earn with his unhurried mastery of pause. They started something new, that summer Rima's idea, Harold's Garden Days. They named it a storytelling circle every other weekend by the old woodpile. Fold-out chairs, lemonade made from Miriam's recipe, folded storybooks with frayed edges passed back and forth. Neighborhood children gathered. So did some adults. Clara told stories sweetened by time. Emma read aloud from her latest tales about animal kingdoms and wandering turtles. Harold never sat in the center, but he was always there, watching, listening, sometimes dozing, sometimes blinking slow approval as new laughter rolled through the garden like wind through grapevines. One crisp evening, as deep gold spilled across the treetops, Clara sat alone beneath the peach tree. A breeze lifted the hem of her sweater. Nearby, Harold shifted, his movements almost reverent. "I wish you'd seen this," she whispered to the branches above. "You'd have liked the laughter. You'd have found a way to scold me for something sweet." A peach blossom drifted down onto her lap. She reached down and placed it gently atop the earth. That night, Emma came to her mother with a page from her latest story. She didn't speak, just held it out. Clara read it slowly. Once, it began, there was a creature who never ran, never shouted, never rose in haste. But he carried something inside him, something softer than shell, steadier than roads. And when the world spun too fast, he stayed still, so others could find their way again. Clara didn't speak, just pulled her daughter close, the paper still warm in her hands. Beyond the garden, dusk curled into navy. The wind combed gently through branches. Every step Harold took seemed quieter than the one before, but no less purposeful. By the time he reached the marigolds, the moon had begun to float in the sky, and beneath that pale light, he settled half in shadow, half in bloom, always present, always home.